can, if you have that sort of superhuman capability, then maybe it will be for the best, but I am definitely not one to judge. Okay, I'm nearly done with the introduction. I did think, particularly after Gail's talk, I should give my credentials for actually giving this talk in the first place. So here they are. I have no research whatsoever, but I think that's okay, because we've all, I've suggested that we all agree being kind is a good thing. We will all have our own ideas about it. I think there would be value in research into kindness. I don't have any of it, but hopefully we can get value without anything formal like that. So, second reminder, you're already kind. It's only a reminder, this talk. I do seem to give a lot of talks. I did yesterday with the drum kit, which I fixed that bug, by the way, where I start off by saying, you won't learn anything new today. And that's probably more true of this talk than of almost any other talk. I don't want you to be thinking that I'm here to nag you, that I think you're terrible people and not kind. But that's not the same as saying that I don't think this talk will have impact. I believe it will, and you've all shown up, okay? You have taken an interest, you've decided with 5 talks, I'm sure the others are excellent, you've decided to come to this one. That means you're interested in kindness, and you have already been thinking about it explicitly. Kindness is something that sort of happens in the background, but we do get to choose what we focus on, what we take notice of. So I'm trying to help you and me to think consciously about being kind more often, just by talking about it. So one extra piece of good news is, the talk is already a success just by you being here. You have made this talk successful, so thank you very much. Does mean if you suddenly think at any point, hey, there was, if either something I say or something else happens and you suddenly think, hey, there was that email that I've just realized how I can respond to kindly, then don't wait for the end of the talk. I am not going to get upset at all if you get your laptop out and start emailing frantically and say, hey, all this kindness I can suddenly do because I've been reminded of it. That's fantastic. Okay, on to actually, what are we talking about? I'm going to have to define kindness for us to progress at all. I want to start off with a negative, which is, I'm not talking about being nice. A sort of shallow, respectable politeness. Okay, I've been almost fighting against politeness recently. I'll mention the church again just very briefly, that I'm a Methodist local preacher, and in our hymn book there's a section called Justice and Peace that I find very, very challenging, because we seem to be kind of nowhere there as a church at the moment. But one of the things I love about our new hymn book is it has hymns that do explicitly talk about rape and child abuse and terrible things that the church has deemed not respectable enough to mention in church for all this time. So this is sort of, and that's a terrible thing for the church, because we need to be aware of all the bad stuff that's going on. So respectability doesn't really do much for me. And while being nice can be part of kindness, I'm looking for something a bit more interesting. So I've sort of broken this down into 3 aspects. Empathy, valuing others, which isn't quite the same thing, and maximizing global long-term impact, which sounds all managery speak, but we'll get there. So let's start with empathy. Gail has already talked about this. Putting yourself, excuse me, in other people's shoes or socks. And it really, this isn't the same as valuing others, because it's only understanding someone else's point of view, where they're coming from. And I have an example of how being in a diverse team or experiencing different things can let you see the world in a different way, which goes back to yesterday's talk. Excuse me just a sec, I really need to cough. Water went down the wrong way. You might think, what does drumming have to do with diversity? But since I started drumming last July, when I listen to music, I hear it completely differently now. How many of you play a musical instrument? Right. When you listen to music that includes that instrument, do you find it easier to hear that part than other instruments' parts? Yeah. It's the same music, but we hear different things in it because we have different experiences. So isn't it going to absolutely be the same for all of our life experiences? We can both walk down the road and you see something that bothers you and I don't see anything that bothers me because I've had an experience, you've had a different experience to me. So our experience will shape what we naturally see, but I do believe that empathy, like kindness, is something we can be deliberate about, and just by consciously trying to understand other people's perspectives, you will get there to some extent. Last year I talked about feminism, and I'm not a woman. I will never experience feminism in the same way as women. I will always have a fairly shallow understanding, but I'm trying, and that in itself has made me notice loads more things than I would have done otherwise. So if we're going to be kind to other people, we need to understand what counts as kindness to them to start with, understand their perspective. We then need to actually value them. Okay? It's possible to understand where someone is coming from, understand their concerns, and say, I don't care. When you used to post to Usenet, or I posted to Usenet a long time ago with a program called TRN, Threaded Read News. There was RN before that. And when you started a new post, it gave you this message. This program posts news to thousands of machines throughout the entire civilized world. Your message will cost the net hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to send everywhere. Please be sure you know what you are doing. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this? Now, these days, crikey, I hope it doesn't cost hundreds or thousands of dollars per message that's going on the net. But that, think about the impact, was a really powerful message to me. I mean, the fact that I remember that it was there and was able to look it up yesterday shows that it had an impact on me. And these days, I think the cost now is not so much in dollars, but in time. Is that message, asking people to be considerate, is that a rude message or a kind message? It's a little abrupt, but I would argue it's at least advocating for kindness. I was wondering what a similar message on Stack Overflow might look like before you ask a question or before you post an answer. I was also wondering whether anyone would read it if there were such a message. I want to give a counterexample of someone not valuing, in this particular case, my time. I had an email this morning with a subject line of, can you help with this? There was no text in the body. There was just a photograph of a monitor with a lot of glare, so it was hard to read anyway. It was also on its side. They hadn't bothered correcting it so that I could just open and read. And it was basically a homework assignment in French. I replied this morning saying, please read, and I have a blog post saying, about personal emails that basically should be Stack Overflow questions that have some thought put into them. But basically that person was saying, right, I value my time so much that I will just take a photo, ask someone else to do my work, and not even make it easy for them to do my work for me. That's not kind. But as soon as you start valuing everybody else's time the same as yours, it really changes your perspective on things. And the third aspect sort of leads from that. As soon as you start valuing each individual's time, that means wherever you can do something, if I'm asking a Stack Overflow question, if it takes me an extra half hour to format it properly, read through it several times, but it takes each person reading it 3 seconds less. I'm going to have to do some maths in a minute. 3 seconds less because of that effort, then if only 600 people read it, then if my maths is right, that's the break-even point. And many questions on Stack Overflow will be read by thousands and thousands of people. So the kind thing to do for all of those other people, even leaving out the idea of, well, I'm asking for help, so I should value your time as a person who's contributing their time willingly, I should value your time more than mine, even leaving that aside, if everyone's time is equal, then the scale factor just is enormous. Taking the time to create a minimal, complete, verifiable example to stop everyone who wants to help you from having to do exactly the same work. It's just efficient. I'm a sucker for efficiency. Sometimes there has to be an unpleasant balance between this, overall impact, and kindness to individuals. I go back to that person who'd emailed me. I replied in a not unfriendly, I didn't say, you idiot, why aren't you being more considerate of my time? I just responded to them with the link to the blog post. I could have fixed the image, typed it all out so that I could then feed it into Google Translate, or seen whether my French was good enough, and basically spent an hour doing their homework. That would have been nice. I'm not sure whether long-term it would have been kind, because I don't think they would have got as much out of it as doing their homework themselves and learning and then making their future experience better. But it wouldn't have been a good use of my time when I could spend the same time, an hour of just answering Stack Overflow questions that everyone can see, will have a greater global impact. So sometimes you need to balance kindness to individuals with kindness to the world in general. So, I've mentioned Stack Overflow a few times. We're here at a tech conference, so it sort of makes sense to think particularly around how kindness happens or doesn't happen in tech. I would say that as an industry, we often lack kindness, both internally and externally, and they are quite different. I'll look first at a few examples of internal and then external. So, in our teams, we have meetings, we interact individually. What does kindness look like, and what does a lack of kindness look like? I think primarily this comes to empathy and understanding that everyone probably wants to say something in the meeting, or at least has something to contribute to the meeting. It's the kind of thing where a really good team will notice when someone has maybe taken up more of the oxygen than is their share, and someone else has been really quiet, And that doesn't mean that the value of their possible contributions is in that same proportion. So in an ideal team, that wouldn't even happen, and the space would just be naturally left. But at least in a good team, anyone, you do not have to be the team leader to say, could we hear from Sandra on this? Because I want to know what she has to say. And also potentially having empathy of, maybe Sandra really doesn't want to say anything, and watching for non-verbal communication and just trying to put yourself in other people's shoes. There are other aspects of team. We're all aware of the team politics that can happen around how do you mentor someone without being patronizing? How do you make sure that when you're divvying up the projects that everyone gets something that can be interesting and stretch them, whether it's stretch or super stretch, without putting too much pressure on them? And this aspect, probably more than all the other slides for internal aspects, isn't really a techie thing. And I think part of the problem in tech is we tend to think of the tech, and human comes second. Whereas humaning is the more important aspect of any team, whether it's in tech or not. Into more specifically tech-oriented things, how many of you do code reviews? Ooh, not as high a proportion as this is no blame here. I'm assuming that everyone who isn't doing code reviews, there's some good reason why they're not doing code reviews, like they're on their own or they're not actually in a coding position, whatever. Definitely no judgment. But I think most of us still were doing code reviews. And as Gail was saying yesterday, code reviews from a junior developer of a senior developer's code is fantastically useful, and so is a senior developer reviewing a junior developer's code. If you can have the attitude of, I always have something to learn from anyone, someone who hasn't been coding for long may not be blinkered in the same way that someone who has been working in this code base for 5 years and knows it in and out, so knows the way that things happen. Whereas someone else is saying, well, hey, I've got this way that it could happen. The possibilities for interaction there are fantastic. What I normally see happening, or I've certainly have seen happening, is don't do it like that, do it like this. There can be little conventions that you can build within your teams, and one that I've certainly seen a lot within Google, and I don't know, I've been in Google nearly 12 years now, which means I find it very difficult to tell which working practices are industry-wide versus just within Google. But if I've got a little nitpick, something that I would like to happen, so for a C# example, calling a constructor using an object initializer, and you're not specifying any arguments to the constructor, I don't like having the parentheses there, and our code base is generally that way. The whole team's kind of agreed that, but sometimes we'll get code reviews for pull requests that someone from outside the team is contributing, and there's nothing wrong with their code, I am just nitpicking. Be really explicit. Say nit, : and then you could use whatever. When you explicitly say you're nitpicking, then they know you're not judging them and saying what you're doing is wrong, but just have you considered? When you see something that's not going to work, or you believe won't work, which is, you can't tell the difference between those things, really. Don't say this isn't going to work. Say, I don't understand how this will work in this situation. Could you add a test for it? if you're right, they will find that there's a bug, they will go and fix it, they will be learning, and then you'll have a test. If you're wrong, you will have learnt by that test being added and passing. Or maybe you'll find that you didn't communicate properly what situation was meant, or that you misunderstood some context. But all of these are positive things, rather than someone feeling, oh, I made a mistake. And I mean, let's face it, we do make mistakes, all of us, but highlighting the positive, what can we learn from this? And hey, the code review is a success if it found a bug and managed to fix it before it got merged. So trying to view code reviews in that sort of positive way can be really important, particularly when there is a sort of power separation between more senior and more junior developers. I can easily, I don't think I've been in the situation, but I can easily empathize with a fairly junior developer. If you've only been in the company a week, maybe you graduated last month or something, and your first code review, you think, I really hope I got this right. Bug, 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 bug. Why on earth would you do that? Like, no, just be kind. And code reviews are one specific example of communication, but far from the only one. I do careers fairs for my daughter's school, my son's school, and another school that we're sort of tangentially involved in. And this is just me sitting at a table saying, careers in software engineering, brackets Google, and I don't really want to talk about Google at all. I will say that I work for Google and that it's great, but I'm not there to talk about Google. I always get people asking about Google, but it's really, I want to encourage people to join this fabulous industry with all its problems. It's still a fabulous industry. And people say, well, what's the most important thing? What should I be focusing on? I'm choosing these A-levels. Does that sound okay? And what I've always been encouraging people to do is make sure that they don't lose all humanities. My own A-levels were maths, further maths, physics, electronics, and an AS in performing arts. Guess which of those I would attribute most to any success I've had in my career. And life in general, actually, given that my wife and I met while doing a tour of a Greek play in Greece, which I possibly wouldn't have done if I hadn't done performing arts. So I can definitely chalk up a very happy marriage to that choice, but also just keeping the soft skills. I hate it too. Velvety. Keeping those velvety skills. Velvety smooth. Sorry? Essential skills. Like it. Yes. Keeping those. I keep encouraging people because all we're doing as software engineers is communicating. And even when we're writing code, we're actually writing poetry. Code is like poetry where you're trying to get at some underlying message and also make it maybe rhyme and fit in with the meter properly. Code, you're writing so that the compiler or whatever is running your code will understand it, but so will someone else coming to maintain it later on. You've got two different audiences. So that's hard writing. So let's get good at writing. And that includes design docs and emails. And you may think, what's that got to do with kindness? Well, I've talked about two audiences for code. If you're thinking about your audience, when you're writing a design doc, think, who's going to read this? And maybe, so I normally start my design docs, all right, title, author, created with a date in ISO 8601 format, because I have far too many American colleagues who put month/day/year and just assume that everyone's going to know what that means without it taking that little bit of extra effort. That's another example of kindness. When US colleagues write dates out in an ISO format, so it means everyone can read it without just that tiny extra friction. It's just little bits of friction. Anytime you can remove those, it's great. What I haven't normally put on design docs, and maybe after today I will start, is audience. And it's not that I don't know who's going to read it, but doing something explicitly, just like we're here today thinking about kindness, and I firmly believe that will make all of you behave a tiny bit more kindly than your already fabulous selves for the next day or whatever. I think explicitly writing the audience will make us bear that audience in mind more. Sometimes your audience will know all the context of all the acronyms you use, and sometimes if it's a wider audience, if you're going for an engineering review across multiple teams, you need to spell things out a bit more. It's not that that audience can't work out what you're saying otherwise, because they'd be able to use whatever internal document system you've got and find out what the acronyms are. But it's easier to click a link if you provide that link. But only when you need to. If you do that all the time, explain everything in massive length, even when the whole audience for this document already know it all, that's adding friction for them. So it's all about tailoring all of your communication to your audience, empathy and valuing their time. A little note about when it can be really hard to be kind, and there are two quite opposite aspects here. So I will go back on what I said earlier and quote some Bible at you. Matthew chapter 5, I think, has Jesus saying, "You have heard it said, love your neighbors and hate your enemies. I tell you, love your neighbors and love your enemies too. Love, love, love your enemies." And that's hard. I am a staunch Remainer. I am trying to be a trans ally, which means I can find it hard to be kind to or think kindly of staunch Brexiteers and gender-critical folks. I find it hard, but I hope I try it anyway. I will fail as often as I succeed, but it's hard. It's hard when people disagree with you. As Karen was saying, if people just don't get it. It's harder still when people are being unkind directly to you. And I go back to what I said about privilege and turn the other cheek. Sounds great in theory, but sometimes it is just superhuman to do that. And if you are being persecuted, it's not for me to judge you if you're not. I will try to come at things from your viewpoint. If you can try to understand and then just walk away, then that's great. But as I say, no judgment. I think it's when being kind is hard that it's probably most valuable to be conscious that you are being kind. Reward yourself. It's okay to think well of yourself for, right, I'm a good boy. I'm being kind to this person who's being mean to me. It's okay to reward yourself like that. But without being conscious of it, without being in a habit of thinking, what's the kind option here, we're much less likely to achieve it. Back into tech, but on the external side, we have product design. And this kind of comes back to what Chris was saying about DevX yesterday and doing user studies. And user studies are basically an acknowledgement that we suck at empathy. Okay? If we could empathize with all of our users to start with, we wouldn't need user studies because we would know everything that we get from them. So do use them. And try to read between the lines of them as well. As I've said several times, I'm not a good UI designer, but one aspect where I would like to think I was showing some empathy and actually being kind to myself as well as my user. I have 2 external users for my drum kit program, and in the very early days, it would crash really early when I was trying a schema for their drum kit. So this was a TD50 that I don't have that module, so I couldn't test it myself, but they would run into problems. And they would send me screenshots of the log, which wouldn't always show everything because it was literally just, they hit print screen. This wasn't terribly useful to me, and it was relatively painful for them as well. So I added a button that just said save log to desktop, and I just asked them what file name they wanted, and then they could attach that by email. Actually going as far as click, email this now or upload this might have been a bit further, but I had to be kind to myself as well. That would probably be more effort than it was worth. But just really trying to put yourself into other people's shoes and not assuming that everyone else is the same as you are. And likewise, documentation. Last night at the pub, we were reminiscing about the joys of 80s computer documentation. The Spectrum manual was mentioned, the BBC Micro manual was mentioned, and these were both large tomes. I learnt trigonometry from the Spectrum manual. And I still look back and think, wow, that's impressive. This was before I would have learnt it in school. It actually confused me a little bit because of the thing that I was doing at the time that made me need to look at that bit of documentation. But it was really good documentation. How many people like writing documentation? That's significantly more than I'd expected. I work on Google Cloud Client Libraries. We do user research. And I've been working on these for about 4 years, and different sort of team structures have come and gone, but I've seen various user studies. Every single one of them, documentation has been the highest priority thing. So clearly that's what we focus on most as a team and put most of our effort into now, right? Wouldn't that be nice? There are efforts. Don't get me wrong. And on the video, please don't fire me. But documentation is one of those things that isn't fun to write, but it is such a kindness. It is probably the best thing that we can do for users in many cases, making the documentation easy to find, easy to navigate, easy to read, that don't assume everyone else is using the same jargon that you are. And community. I've already talked about Stack Overflow. Our communities have varying degrees of kindness. Last night, Q and Gail were talking about the Python community and saying that basically is it a pretty kind community? Bloody awesome. That's wonderful. I would love every tech community to be thought of not just by themselves. So what I didn't ask is, how many of you aren't in the Python community but have experience of the Python community? Would you say it's awesome as well? Because that's the real acid test, as it were. But there's a lot of unkindness in the community, and that's partly modeled on some of the tech leaders that I could name but probably don't need to. Do not model kindness as well as they might. They may model awesome technical leadership in a technical way, and they can make decisions and reject the right pull requests that are doing the right thing, but reject it in a horrible way. I would love us to see, and I think it's starting to happen, we are seeing community leaders and tech leaders who are kinder, and that is valued within the community. So if you are whether it's a member of a community going to a meetup or a leader of a meetup and arranging speakers and whatever, if you can make kindness one of the things that community explicitly values, even calling it out at the start of meetings if you want, I think we'll be in a better place. Finally, a lot of this sounds like it's, right, I've got to go and be nice to everyone and be kind to everyone and do all kinds of things for everyone else. I'm going to be exhausted. And you're absolutely right, you would be. You've got to practice self-kindness as well. Sometimes I feel guilty about the amount of time that Holly and I just spend most evenings slumped in front of the telly. Shouldn't I be spending more time, whether it's on Stack Overflow, or maybe I've got new users for the drum module, or maybe I should just do extra documentation for my libraries out of the goodness of my heart? I'll burn out. Going back to that third point in my definition of maximizing long-term global benefits, if you burn out, then not only may you stop being able to be kind, you may explicitly go the other way. We have, going back to church yet again, we have a conversation thing in a couple of weeks at church. The Methodist Church is deciding whether or not to allow Methodist ministers and premises to be used for same-sex marriage. And this has provoked a lot of controversy. And one of the exercises we're using is to measure how passionate we are about this topic. Just as a reminder that if you're passionate, you may be argumentative and not listening to other people. And that will absolutely happen if you burn yourself out being so nice to everyone, so kind to everyone, not the same as nice, so kind to everyone that you then say, oh, this community is just take. Right? If you've given everything, you had that choice to give, make the choice to be kind to yourself as well. I'm out of time, so my conclusion slide will actually just be my final slide. Be kind to yourself and others. Thank you so much for choosing to come to this talk on kindness. Ignore everything I've said if you like, but think about kindness and do it. Thank you.